Welcome, patrons, for another Sunday show, including a new feature, which I'll tentatively title the Article Canon. We're not going to say how we're going to spell canon. I kind of like it, C-A-N-N-O-N, but, you know, play on words is everything here.
The problem is people don't believe that you're doing a play on words and just think you're dumb. If you're doing anything too cute.
True, yeah. Unless we have like a graphic, like a cannon shooting an article into somebody's head. But before we get into that inaugural. This is a very inaugurable article. This is by Sam Gindin. I want to get to what I teased on Tuesday night, which is Governor Noem of South Dakota dressing up like a nurse to show support for the state's nursing shortage. She had this, here's this ad that hit the airwaves in South Dakota recently. Just like everyone pitching in and helping out.
Let's get some help in here. Stat. We've got close to 20,000 open jobs in South Dakota, including for nurses. So I'm helping out until we fill them. South Dakota is the freest state in the nation. We work hard, but we don't pay any state income tax. So you get to keep more of your own money. That should get your heart racing.
South Dakota. Freedom works here.
I think I took a wrong turn.
Yeah, it's a little bit of funny humor about sort of accidents in hospitals. Which, you know, if you go into overcrowding and issues of maybe like travel nursing, which South Dakota's had to avail itself much upon, getting nurses to come in and fill these positions, often at much greater cost. The joke doesn't quite hit maybe if you had somebody have some sort of accident, which is a regularly occurring cause of death in this country. So just little jokes, just some jokes there. But I'll also mention, you know, South Dakota hasn't had income tax for a long time, and yet it still has this nursing shortage. And I have my favorite reasons that I like to point to for South Dakota healthcare that go to my conspiracy brain. For instance, this one here, T. Denny Sanford. Billionaire T. Denny Sanford cut from the Giving Pledge after child porn probe documents released. Sanford not ultimately charged. He might have died, and maybe he's still holding on. He's an old guy who's a subprime credit mogul turned hospital owner turned I'm going to put my name on everything, and then I'm going to get investigated for child porn because I have access to accounts with pictures of young girls. Sanford Health is it will tell you proudly, the number one rural health provider or system in this country. Now, it's based in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, so you might think, well, that must be good news for nurses in South Dakota. You have the number one rural healthcare provider in South Dakota. Well, unfortunately, South Dakota ranks at number 51 here in terms of nurse salary. That is below only above our colonial possession, Puerto Rico. You might ask yourself, how is it number 51? I thought there was only 50 states. Well, this includes District of Columbia. You also look mean wage by registered nurses. There's South Dakota, down there with Iowa, a lot of states in the Mississippi Delta, notably states, as we'll get to, that didn't expand Medicaid. Highest, you look at the hourly mean wage here. South Dakota below, despite having this monopoly run by a guy investigated for child pornography, subprime credit guy, a lower hourly wage than West Virginia, Mississippi. So maybe, and you'll see like in the coverage of this, a lot of talk of like, oh, we're trying to do grants. We just need to show these, nurses what it's like to be, that might be going in Minnesota, what it's like to be a nurse in a rural setting. Well, North Dakota is also rural. Like, North Dakota is not any more meaningfully urban than South Dakota, but it pays more. Now, in part, that's more progressive politics, slightly, marginally. than South Dakota. Also, a little bit to do with economic benefits of, say, the oil that South Dakota doesn't benefit from. But also, I want to get to Medicaid expansion, because South Dakota was one of these states that decided not to expand Medicaid with the Affordable Care Act. And here's Kristi Noem's answer in the 2000, and she opposed it when she ran and became governor in 2019. She opposed it in 2022. Ultimately, a ballot initiative passed it. And here's Noem taking a question from that in their debate in 2022.
Next question, and we'll be beginning with Governor Noem. Medicaid expansion on the November ballot. Many have said that having citizens vote on specific issues during elections is one of the best ways to understand what voters really want. But the state seemingly has a history of not abiding by voters' decisions, notably recreational marijuana 2020, ethics structure in 2018. Both were challenged or overturned by the state government. If voters approve Medicaid expansion, would you commit to carrying out the will of the voters on this issue? And Governor Noem, you have 2 minutes.
Well, once again, looking at this measure, it appears to be written constitutionally. So if the people pass it, it'll be implemented. But let me cover a few facts on Medicaid in our state. Medicaid covers healthcare costs for those today in our state that are living in poverty, that may be single moms struggling to make ends meet, some senior citizens, and those that are disabled. What expansion would do would be cover more individuals. It would cover the majority of those would be younger individuals that are single, able-bodied, able to go get a job and a career here in South Dakota and have the potential to earn benefits that would pay their medical bills. The approximate cost to the state of South Dakota would be in the future up to $80 million per year. And that is something that we would have to figure out how to pay for. So I think when looking at this decision on the ballot, it's good to have the facts of who would be covered, how much it would cost, and know that we have a responsibility in South Dakota to balance our state budget. Listen, we've always been fiscally responsible. South Dakota has a constitutional requirement to balance the budget, and we've done that. In fact, since I've been governor, we put more money into reserves than we've ever done before in our history. We have a AAA credit rating, the best pension fund in the nation.
Blah, blah, blah. You got the lowest paid nurses and a massive shortage. Great on that. Now, this who benefits thing is when they say, people, it's, well, now people in poverty benefit. This is how we define poverty, right? Actually, a lot of people very close to poverty, what we would consider not getting by in this country, regardless of what some, statistician defines as poverty. And including lots of people in rural communities, lots of people in tribal areas. And you know what? Noem is assaulting those people's way of life with this. Like, for all by not providing them ability to get health care where they're at. Oh, you should move to Sioux Falls. You should move to one of these cities. You should destroy the area you're from, leave that, and work for a capitalist that, I don't know, the main industries in South Dakota, like, ironically, healthcare is one of them, despite everybody being underpaid in it. This is what we talk about with economics alienating you from your society based on people making the economic decisions in the state want. So but also we need to get to this other thing she's talking about, which is like, oh, we need to worry if this is going to bankrupt South Dakota. Well, I would just point you to the Rand Institute, which is not the left-wing think tank by any means, very like establishment. But this is how they talk about a Medicaid expansion. This is a few years ago now, so some of these states that says hasn't expanded it have since then, but including South Dakota. But here's when we talk about the economics of it, some things to keep in mind.
In the summer of 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that the Medicaid expansion piece of the Affordable Care Act was optional for states. We looked at the 14 states that at the time of the study were deemed least likely to expand Medicaid and found that in those 14 states, about 3.6 million fewer people would have health insurance. The people that are most affected by a state's decision to expand Medicaid will be low-income individuals, the most vulnerable segment of our population. In addition to the coverage implications, there are also cost effects. Those states that do not expand Medicaid will see about $8 billion less in federal spending annually. This is money that would be used to pay nurses and doctors and other medical professionals for the services that they provide. they would then spend the money in the general economy and pay taxes on it. If the 3.6 million people don't have health insurance, they'll still be using health care. And part of that will be picked up by the state and local governments. And in those 14 states, we estimate that that will total more than $1 billion. When the Supreme Court ruled last year that states could opt out of Medicaid expansion, they didn't allow states to opt out of any other part of the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act pays for the Medicaid expansion through new taxes, fees, and reductions in spending in other programs. These funds will be raised from all states, but will not be spent in those states that turn down Medicaid expansion. So in some sense, the states are already paying for Medicaid expansion regardless of whether or not they take it. We found that Medicaid expansion was in the best interest of the low-income population because this is the best way for them to get health insurance. We also found that it's in the fiscal interest of states because they see additional federal spending and reduced spending on uncompensated care. There's no doubt that this is a polarizing topic. But
because why? Now, that's what I think that's fascinating, right? So, like, you're already paying for it. And also, it's a net benefit, like, economically. Like, that's a mathematician from the Rand Institute. Now, he has to end saying it's a polarized issue. I think Marxists understand why, right? And it goes into exactly why Noem said. Those people should be going and finding a way to serve a capitalist somewhere, rather than just getting healthcare where they're at and being able to be freer individuals. They need to uproot and go, work in Sturgis, slinging drinks to bikers or something. Like, there's the opportunity that they want. And I think that's so fascinating, because there is a contradiction. And this is one of the core contradictions that, since I've been following politics, right, is when I was in college, this debate, the Obamacare debate was going on, and the numbers make sense. The numbers are, yes, we should actually even probably do more than what we should definitely actually even do. Even like Ezra Klein and people like that were saying, like, we should have a public option and things like this. We should actually be going further. But why don't we? It's because we want to use this imperative for capitalists and local business owners in the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a huge benefit to be able to threaten people's access to medicine and life-saving procedures. And tie that up to your employment. And
exactly.
It's also very funny to watch folks like Noem and the rest of them continue this attack on healthcare when it's directly costing states like South Dakota or here in Texas significant amounts of money to make. Like, it's not even just like, oh, they're not going forward on this like kind of positive program, let's call it, right? Providing more healthcare to some folks. It actually is like paying into a system to create poverty and desperation. Is what it ends up being if you look at the actual costs of that to the state government. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yep. And so luckily last year, 56% of South Dakotans voted to expand Medicaid, and there's been some talk of work requirements that Republicans want to add to it, but as far as I can tell now, maybe some South Dakotans can update me, it looks like it's going to go through. So that is Kristi Noem, and hopefully, that'll do something to alleviate this, more investment. But again, we actually need to expand these services. Like, Bernie was one candidate. Like, his rural healthcare plan actually had a significant number of investment. Ultimately, Medicare for all is what we need. Like, we can't have this bifurcated system, because ultimately, where you have the government program be less remunerative to healthcare systems, because then, it's better to have more people with the ability to pay, even if they're paying less. But ultimately, we need to be investing into these communities. So, doctors aren't making only more than Puerto Rico. And nursing is an important job, folks. Like, Kristi Noem can joke about accidentally wheeling a patient into a loading area. That shit happens all the time. And it happens more regularly, statistically, the more that nurses are overstaffed. And, this is stuff we all got to take seriously.
Well, shall we jump to this new, what are we calling this, article canon?
The article canon.
Article canon here. I mean, this is a piece that I've always been a big fan of. It's a piece by Sam Gindin, who y'all should all be reading if you aren't already in general. He has been one of the preeminent theorists of democratic socialist movements, the labor historian, economic historian, a real titan of thought on the left. He was also the collaborator with Leo Panditch, who passed away a couple years back. This piece is, I think, really phenomenal, and I'll just put it up on screen really fast for y'all. It's interesting for a few reasons. One, because it tackles, I think, a kind of critical question, and two, because of when it was written. So Building a Mass Socialist Party by Sam Gindin. This was published in Jacobin in 2016, in December 2016. So this is sort of preempted, being written before the full extent of, I mean, before, Trump, the Trump presidency and the Biden presidency, right? And it's interesting to sort of see some of these lessons, how they might have played out in these past few years. But it's also, I think, kind of critical to sort of start from the place that Gindin's starting here, which is that we are sort of at step one for thinking about what a socialist movement, what a socialist party would look like in the United States and in Canada by extension. And I mean, I think we can sort of dive into it. We're not going to do a full line by line read, but we're going to sort of take y'all through the main arguments of the piece and talk about it a little bit. I will just say up top, I've always found, I think, the party question to be one of the most critical and important. And it's one of those things where, like, people get really hot and bothered about, the Democratic Party or, dreams of actually having a strong, viable socialist or communist party in this country. But more often than not, it's like kind of aesthetic stuff, right? It's, do I want to be seen as somebody who hangs out with liberals? I don't want to be the Democratic Party because they're, take your soul. I would rather, get to wear red T-shirts and things like that. And it's, people get really worked up about it. It's a big fight. It's not particularly interesting because it doesn't really go into the function and the importance of what a political party is for the socialist movement. Because for most Americans, when they think of political party, they only think about one thing and one thing only. What is the letter going to be next to somebody when you go and vote for them on election day? And that is just so far away from actually what we're going to be discussing today. What the actual kind of socialist Marxist vision of a political party is. And, to be fair, what is that? Well, if you think about the union as the organ, this is borrowing from Sam Gindin elsewhere, but like if you think about the union is the organization of the working class at the shop floor, at the work site, all this kind of stuff. The political party is the organization of the working class on the national social level. And why is this important? Because, the Socialist Party and this kind of political party has more than just the goal of, we want to put up candidates for office. It's an actual national, and ideally international organization, that is set up to be able to flex the muscle of the working class, to be able to get the demands of working class people, to expand the capacity and power of working class folks, and to be able to orchestrate, plan, and act on the national level. So yes, that does mean voting. That also means doing things like a lot of people online love to call for all the time. A national strike. You want to call a national strike, you're going to have a hell of a lot better time organizing that and doing that if you're going through a party structure that is organized has workers all across the country in all different sections and sectors of employment than, just sort of tweeting and yelling about it all the time. So, the party question is absolutely critical. But a lot of times when people talk about the party, they're sort of like, okay, well, what we need is a brand and an identity and a logo, and that's a party, and then people are going to come. People have launched 1 million left-wing socialist parties in this country and all across the globe. And we're still sitting here in 2023. The last one that was viable and mainstream was the Socialist Party. And that sort of collapsed. Going into the FDR administration at the height of labor power, once a lot of the more radical unions became more embedded within the Democratic Party, and things were feeling good in the U.S. economy in like the 50s and 60s. You start to see this kind of breakdown of those old socialist movements. So anyway, we can dive into the piece, but I think thinking about what a party is and how to organize something like that can actually orchestrate and move the working class on a national and political level is absolutely critical for any socialist serious about actually confronting capitalism. And I think Sam Gindin is one of the best people to write about it. So yeah, we can dive in a little bit here. Unless sorry, I know I just did a long ass preamble. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, no, that's a good. There's a few sections later I want to point to, but if there's anything in the first couple paragraphs.
Yeah, I was thinking, so we're going to sort of take you all through the piece here. For me, I think this little bit in the first in the intro is important. After the multi-decade defeat of the labor movement is precisely such bases of deep support that are so conspicuously absent. External factors like another economic crisis, even if it leads to powerful political backlash, will not magically generate this foundation. He's talking about a working class base. Nor will it come about through some spontaneous dynamic internal to unions. In the current moment, the creation of such a working class base has its own preconditions. A central one, bringing our dilemma full circle, is a significant socialist presence in the working class. We constantly face a seemingly irresolvable impasse. No party without a base, no base without a party. Is there a way out of this closed circle? And I think that sort of sets up what this piece is going to be investigating here. And, that is like the tension, is that like we have to find a way to build up a base that doesn't exist right now. And this would be really hard to have an organization that can build a base without a base. I think that is the kind of puzzle of the American kind of socialist movement, going all the way back to the Socialist Party, to the more recent U.S. Labor Party in the 90s, which we should definitely do a deep dive on. Maybe even see if Adolph Reed would be interested in sort of walking us through some of those lessons there. But for people who don't know, that was a movement of a bunch of radicals, union leaders across the country who, with the intention of actually building a working class party in the United States. It had some successes, ultimately, didn't end up becoming viable. But it was a very genuine attempt to do something that you see sort of get pitched again today. And I think it's important to look at some of the lessons there, but that might be for another episode. And I
do think it's interesting him, this next section on the there is no alternative sort of period, because I do think that it might be difficult for people a generation below us to realize what that was like. Like, I often, I remember being exposed to Marx as a freshman as the financial crisis was hitting, like Lehman's going under and Obama's like about to transition into the White House, and it wasn't really, it was like a museum piece, right? Like Marxism wasn't nearly as in the conversation as it is right now, and I think that is in part why basically the most progressive president that we were all so excited for turned to bankers. Ultimately, and speaking of Adolph Reed, had predicted Obama would do something very similar to that, basically because of his diagnosis of the problem with the left and how it become sort of NGO-ified and like sort of liberal careerist ladder. But yeah.
No, absolutely. And let's get into a little bit of the history that Gindin lays out here, because I think it's really important, to get this right, because I think so much of the left post Bernie has been a kind of question like, how could we revive a kind of, left social democratic movement? And certainly that would be preferable to what we have today in regards to the Democratic Party. But I think Gindin actually sort of starts to break down some of the reasons why, we actually need a socialist movement, not just like a return to social democracy. But anyways, let's get to this history here. And for people who need any credentials on Sam Gindin, Sam Gindin has written, probably along with Leo Panitch, probably one of the most comprehensive economic histories of the makings of global capitalism is highly worth jumping into. So this is somebody who's writing from a position of expertise on these things. But he opens up here by talking a little bit about the 1960s and the economic boom that followed that. And then he notes, as the post-war boom faded in the second half of the 1960s, corporations first stumbled toward reviving profits and growth then. By the end of the 1970s, capitalist elites reached a crucial consensus. There was a new world out there and options within it were polarized. The middle road of the welfare state was no longer a workable alternative. It got in the way of the profitable restructuring of the economy. It was consequently essential to put a brake on and ultimately reverse the advances made by workers. Only more capitalism, that is an orientation to more deeply subordinating both the private and the social life to capitalist discipline, could restore the trajectory of domestic and global accumulation. And this is a history we're very familiar with. This is the birth of neoliberalism, both in the terms of, some of the politicians who you associate with that turn, but also in the kind of restructuring of the American and the global economy to sort of break the power of unions, to weaken the power of the welfare state, to undo all the reforms that were won in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the birth of the world that we now live in. And Gindin notes that capital really understood this moment. Capital grasped the political implications of this moment, but labor did not. With some exceptions, unions expected or hoped that this was a temporary setback that would end once the economy turned up or the political winds reversed. And very clearly it didn't, because this was something that was structural to the capitalism. And I think that this goes back to like this kind of fundamental point about, what if we could just revive, social democracy or, some form of labor peace with a high level of social welfare programs, some restrictions on some higher taxes here or there, things like that. Well, no, because as Gindin and Panish sort of make clear in their longer book, and as Gindin writes in this piece, fundamentally what capital was reacting to was difficulty in profitability for these corporations. So they had to find a way to squeeze labor more and more. So the middle road, the kind of peace between labor and capital that sort of marked the period of social democracy, it was just unattainable. And look, I think that if you look at the globe, this is where sometimes having a kind of international perspective can really help you understand what we're getting at about like the structural issue here. There are a bunch of countries out there with very different histories, with very different levels of how they respond to this crisis. But Lord, help us. I mean, all across the globe, all of the victories of social democracy have been under threat. Even in the much lauded, like Nordic countries, you saw significant pullbacks of the victories and gains for the working class. And you look at what it is like today, again, it's nicer than American in certain ways. But still, like there was a better world to even to return to, right? Things have regressed. And that's something functional, structural in capitalism. Labor was, as Gindin sort of writes, was not really prepared to meet this moment, in the 60s. And the left was just out to fucking lunch. The left had sort of turned, more and more toward the social movements, did not have a strong, fundamental critique of capitalism, that was, viable or working with unions to be able to speak about what was going on. Everything was sort of like, Reagan is bad. This current right-wing figure is bad, sort of identifying very much with individual movements and things like that, instead of seeing like the actual structural shifts that were happening globally. So this left the working class pretty impotent to fighting back about something. In fact, a lot of people didn't really see or recognize what was happening.
I like him referencing the Leonard Cohen lines. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost. Everybody knows the boat is leaking. Everybody knows the captain lied. Yeah, that's depressing, but yeah, that's a good summary of the era.
No, I think so. And he says, without a mass socialist movement demonstrating otherwise, it was not surprisingly very hard to hang on to other possibilities. Social democracy was hardly an alternative. And mentions how in Canada, the left in Canada had moved past identifying with socialism, and in Canada, the Liberal Party, like the Democratic Party in the United States, offered little more than a vague promise of a kinder neoliberalism. And we all saw what that happened. And then he sort of notes, I want to get to sort of more of the brunt of the piece here, but he notes that the radical left didn't really recognize what was going on with neoliberalism. I sort of laid that out. And he makes this note here that, really sticks with me. He says the left, already weak by then, was for the most part reduced to bearing witness. And that's basically been a lot of left-wing politics since that moment. And I do think you can sort of see some attempts to even return to that kind of orientation. It's like, we see this and this is sad, and that's sort of the end of it.
Well, and that's become the dominant, liberal vernacular too.
Yeah.
We see, look at what Trump's doing. Let us send you some emails and stuff like that. Yeah.
And then he sort of notes about the dream of some kind of economic shock, shifting and waking people up, how that was going to happen. Noting when the great financial crisis hit in 2007. It seemed that a profound reaction from below would finally come. The legitimacy of bankers, financiers, corporate elites, more generally state institutions and political parties took a severe beating. Yet once again, there was no political explosion, no new sign of a robust base for new politics. As significant as the discrediting of establishment institutions was, that on its own was not enough. And he goes on to sort of say, Occupy looked interesting, but didn't really move us. And that's why it becomes interesting that what did end up sort of shaking American politics, and creating a lot of hope and opportunity for a new left in this country. It was Bernie Sanders, running, a fairly for American Sanders radical campaign, but within the Democratic Party. And again, the question here is not, this is not a kind of history of the left. This is a kind of question about how to build a mass party. So on that note, I think we can sort of move to looking at some of the lessons from Sanders and maybe setting that up using Gindin's piece as a base. One thing I think is, one of the kind of contradictions that a lot of people get tripped up in, is what is the lesson that you can take from the Bernie Sanders movement and some of the successes and mobilizations that came from it? Because as, radical and different as the Sanders campaign was, he was still running within the Democratic Party. What does that mean? We sort of know the difficulties and the problems with the Democratic Party, but it is also just undeniable. It is undeniable that if Bernie Sanders would have run an independent campaign, young guys like me, fresh out of college would probably have voted, for the Sanders Independent Party. And it would have been like an interesting little historical tidbit and not really something that sort of shook and fundamentally altered American politics. There's just no way around it that if Bernie Sanders doesn't run the Democratic Party primary, this kind of shift of potential that we've seen for this movement just doesn't occur, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I have these paragraphs here. Is that backwards, or can you read that?
I can read it, yeah.
Okay. To begin with, Sanders rose through an established party. Though political parties have suffered a profound degree of delegitimation, this has not sidelined them. Their continuing economic and social impacts ensure their continuing relevance. That they were nevertheless weak and gave individuals like Sanders not tainted with being party, we know that. Had Sanders run as an independent, without the on-the-ground resources of the Democratic machine and the profile of running as a Democrat, it was highly unlikely, as he well knew, that his campaign would have had anywhere near the impact it did, just as attempts to form a left party outside the British Labour Party have generally quickly faded. For all the discrediting of political parties, party politics remains a central site for being taken seriously. Starting a new party from scratch is something else and presents formidable difficulties. And then continue with this one here. A second and ultimately more fundamental problem was that for all the achievements of the Sanders campaign, it was in crucial respects organizationally thin, as evident by how quickly it seemed to disappear when it formally folded and how difficult it now is to revive. The deep organizing capacity and institutional building fundamental to a sustained challenge to a capitalist power was simply not built to the campaign or not built prior to the campaign or during it. The point is not that elections are to be rejected as a site of struggle, but that they derive their importance from expressing an already existing developed social base. And I think that is one thing I wish I could get through to a wide range of people who come out in polar opposites of what to do on voting day.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the first point there about the criticism of or recognition of one of the problems with the Sanders campaign is that, yeah, it didn't build like a strong organization. Like, you know, you can forgive him because when he was writing this piece, he couldn't really tell the future. You know, our revolution obviously built nothing to the scale that was sort of necessary. It's, you know, it's just a shame that Bernie Sanders.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you know what's fascinating about that is like Obama did the same thing. There was articles in like 2014, like what's Obama doing to organizing for America and demobilization. And then like, let's let our consultants handle it. And, you know, I'm not saying that's exactly what Bernie did the same way Obama did, but that's the problem. You know, and maybe there's something to the proximity to a campaign, a presidential campaign that leads to that.
Well, I mean, this is the kind of the point here, though, is that, like, you know, despite Bernie Sanders sort of running a kind of radical campaign, you know, at least in messaging for American politics, you know, the kind of strategy is like, okay, so we basically mobilized and got a lot of people into, you know, a different kind of way of doing politics, different way of thinking. Yeah, we're going to basically do the same kind of organization that Obama did that didn't really take off or do too much. You know, it was bizarre. I mean, you know, if Bernie Sanders would have told his supporters, at the end of 2016 or 2020, you know, join an organization like the Democratic Socialists of America, or join, you know, whatever organization that if he wanted to start it and be at the center of it, you know, that'd be one thing, but he didn't. And I think that sort of, this gets to, one of the big kind of challenges and tasks of actually building a successful, movement, which is, as you noted, your favorite line there, Matt. The point is that elections are not, the point is not that elections are to be rejected as a site of struggle, but that their importance lies in the fact that they are expressing an already existing developed social base. And that work, the social bases aren't just things that like naturally froth up and like appear. They're actually things that are cultivated and constructed through like on the ground political work. And that just wasn't happening with the Sanders movement. And that's exactly what has to happen to actually build any kind of party or party formation in this country. And that work just, you know, the people who were really dedicated about never voting for a Democrat, for example, seem to be very uninterested in that actual like base building capacity, right? It's a dream that like all these people are just sort of sitting out there waiting for their chance to go and support, you know, a radical candidate. And it just, that will never, ever happen. Things come from actual work. You know, spontaneity is like a weird fetish of a lot of leftists. You know, everything, from, you know, the success of Eugene Debs in this country to the Bolshevik Revolution, those things didn't just come out because, you know, an apple cart got knocked over at the right time and people started rioting. No, that happened because of years and years of dedicated work in articulating and building, you know, a socialist movement. And it wasn't that it was 100%, in like, 1-to-1 represent, you know, members and like the actual existing class in any of those examples. But rather that more and more people from the working class in both of those examples, were becoming members, or at least being exposed to these concepts, from an actively and engaged, socialist party, or organization. And that's, you know, and that just gets into the work, but let's keep going a little bit here. Because he notes this, you know, because again, as you know, the Bernie Sanders moment is like absolutely critical, and you know, we're being critical of it right now. But let's be very clear here. It's only because of the successes that came out of that movement, that we're able to have these conversations and take them seriously today. So the criticism is not to say, oh, we shouldn't have done that, Bernie's bad, or anything like that.
Yeah, I'd say it's almost like we just wish it was more concentrated, because I still think you see some of the force with the way like DSA, probably Bernie people are involving themselves within different unions, and you see the way you know, leadership votes have gone and things like that, and a more bold approach. Like, I think it's just like you say, like a little bit of a shame that this wasn't, and a lot of people went to DSA But again, like a lot of people went to DSA because Bernie kind of had this, what would you call it, like an arm's length relationship?
Because Bernie Sanders called himself a democratic socialist, and there was a big organization called the Democratic Socialists of America.
That's the first one that came up on Google, yeah.
I mean, I don't want to trivialize it too much, but like, there's no doubt about it that, that organization, was able to have tremendous success in membership, that probably weren't very reflective of, all the work that was being done beforehand. And, Gindin sort of makes this point here too. It's like, what's notable about the Bernie Sanders moment? It's not that like, oh, all of these certain conditions and economic crises happened at the right time at the right place. What was important about Bernie Sanders, I think this is a really critical thing here, is it was that Sanders seemed to offer a practical vehicle for changing things in the here and now through a political process, the United States primary, that wasn't destined to marginalization, that included progressive programmatic principles, was led by someone with an exceptional aura of authenticity, and demanded limited, if still significant, life commitments. So while it was an unambiguous step up, the Sanders moment, like other protest moments, was still primarily a shortcut to radical politics. And I think that this sort of gets at the heart of one of the things that we're sort of up against on the left right now. He ends this section. I'll just read this here. The lesson isn't that the movement came close and only needs to try harder next time. It is that it needs, in organizational terms, to try differently. And, you just sort of see this with folks who I think very clearly just sort of want to do Sanders again. And like, oh, well, we learned the lessons. We can have a different media strategy. This is some of the stuff around like the Cornel West campaign, for example, which is, it's almost, you can't even really compare it to the Sanders campaign just because it's just not having the same kind of effect. But that's a test case for some people that sort of say, oh, if only we had somebody who was saying the certain kind of things that we want them to say, in an entertaining and interesting way. It's like, well, you're seeing where that sort of goes. It'd be the same thing if there was, let's say, like a strong progressive candidate who's polling very well, against Biden right now, the kind of, Bernie 2.0. It'd be the same kind of thing if none of these structural differences were addressed. I think that this is something that a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their heads around, is that, the Bernie Sanders moment again was good. But it was a shortcut, to the kind of organization and strategy, to the goal that we need to be pursuing, which is an end to the capitalist system, building socialism, all of that. And to be able to even start that process, you actually have to think about politics in a very, very different way, which is like a very engaged, very democratic, very organized, very mobilized group of people, instead of the kind of more passive volunteer here and there, vote in primary. And that's like politics. And that's just never going to be able to take on the capitalist class, and deal with the major issues that we're facing. So as he says, we have to not just try harder, but actually try differently.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few other sections here. I don't want to skip over too much, but this section here, it's going to remind me of what we might be seeing a little bit with like the UAW stuff. And let me see if I can find this example of the UAW. Hold on. Yeah, here it is. Okay, sorry. The example of U.S. Labor Party underscores tricky questions for socialists operating within such a party. How much of an emphasis should be put on socialist education? This is, I don't know if you know much about the 90s socialist or U.S. Labor Party, but where and when does the development of specifically socialist cadre as opposed to progressive organizers and campaigners occur? Should workers be recruited to a socialist caucus within a larger organization? Will this undermine the party's internal unity? With such activities and debates which inevitably spill into the public domain, isolate the party? It's interesting just that you look at the way like the UAW, some of the moves have been portrayed as the campus activists or the younger socialists swaying the traditional workers thing. But I've been I guess, heartened by how little that those attacks like have taken root, I guess, because the union itself seems pretty open to the more radical approach.
100%. And I think that, the kind of questions that he's asking in that section are really interesting and important. And, this whole section, just for people following along, is called Building Capacity. And I think that really does identify something that I think a lot of people, even people who advocate for starting a new party, they oftentimes sort of envision that as a more passive activity for membership. And what do I mean by that, by passive? It's sort of like, oh, do you support this organization? You might be donate some money, maybe even knock on doors and come election time and you vote for them, right? That's membership. No. Capacity here, what they're talking about here with the socialist movement is something that is actually incredibly engaged. So, the idea of socialism, I mean, let's be very clear here. Socialism is not just a kind of laundry list of like policies that we like. It's a belief that everyday people, should be able to rule over themselves. Well, to do that, you have to build up the capacity, of both, actually like creating the organization and the structure and the way you organize society so that people can, influence, and interact and engage and direct, economic life, political life, things like that. That's democracy, right? In a longer way of describing that. And then also the capacity to be able to think and conceptualize and, consider what is actually like in front of them and what needs to be done about that, right? So there's two things, like actually building the kind of vehicle so that people can influence the world, and then building the knowledge of like how to drive, right? How do you govern society? What kind of economic programs do we need? What kind of structures do we need to be able to function? That's popular public education so that people understand what it is that they're doing. And, how do you build that? It's a two-sided thing. There's a part of it that like being engaged in that work, is educating. But to be engaged in that work also means that some people have to start. So trying to figure out a way of like combining like the actual like education work, in the socialist movement for working people, and having that being developed in tandem, with the actual like kind of structural capacity. I mean, maybe just before 30 minutes, maybe just a kind of brief way to describe this is like one of the points that Panish has made many times is like one of the great shames of the Soviet Union was that, it starts out with this moment of like mass democratization. A lot of people who didn't have a lot of influence over society suddenly have a lot of power and influence. And people are starting to have to engage in politics, engage in democracy, engage in all these things that they previously weren't really exposed to and participating in that way. Radical moment. Things break open socially, economically, politically, all across the country. Well, the revolution hardens very quickly in the Soviet Union, and the fear is, okay, we can't let this disappear. So the Communist Party in the Soviet Union becomes very hard, and it actually starts to stop actually consulting with and working with the everyday people, right? So that democracy that opens up actually collapses. And then, when the Soviet Union ends, everyday people weren't consulted or engaged in the actual life of governing themselves at all, right? And, so understanding that as a kind of thing that we don't want to cultivate is I think fundamental to the kind of democratic socialist perspective, is like how to make sure that we're building structures that are like open and are building up, not just in the sense of like, oh, we want these people to support us, but actually building up without using things like, because the idea of the Soviet Union is that like one day the people are going to be sort of tricked and they're going to vote away the revolution, right? That's why democracy was limited there. But obviously the problem is like once you start limiting people's access to democracy and power and influence over their life, well, then the revolution is over and the democracy is over and the dream is over, right? So the idea and the argument here from the democratic socialist perspective is that we want to empower people to rule and make their own decisions over their life. But we also have to do this kind of work of education. So yeah, we don't go into a situation where, we achieve all this kind of stuff and then we see it undermined by some kind of, demagogue, anti-socialist figure in some kind of future, right? These are capacity questions, right? And then there's the other capacity aspect of like actually building up the capacity of working class people to engage in politics on a mass level, on the shop floor, and all this kind of stuff. So anyways, these are like the fundamental party questions here that are absolutely necessary for us to be considering.
Yeah, and I think he also cites Jane McAlevey here. We're at, this is again in 2016, we're at what the moment seems to call for is a sober step back and, borrowing from Jane McAlevey, implementation of a stress test. McAlevey prefers the term structure test. Let's test ourselves. Do the commitments and capacities exist to establish a loose but relatively coherent socialist current across the country? If this can't be done, then bravely announcing the formation of a new party won't go anywhere. And that's how I feel about that's why people are like confused about why I don't feel excited about Cornel West or Marianne Williamson, for instance. It's like I appreciate their ideas, but like I appreciated Bernie's honestly even more, and even he lacked like this sort of more like we're starting something new here. And we're creating organization that is going to sustain itself into the future. I don't see Marianne doing that. And I don't see Cornel Rust really doing that either. And maybe the PSL candidates are doing that better, La Riva and I forget who. But it's until I still feel like the most exciting stuff is these unions, whether it's Starbucks or UAW or teachers unions or whoever, that I think are getting a little bit more bold. I mean, I think Fein is the easiest example of somebody who's like consciously following, because you see things like the ceasefire demand, and like that's a type of demonstration. It's they don't have control over the war machine, but that's using their structure to give voice to their what they want to see to happen in politics, and we need to encourage more of that.
And I mean, if you look at Fein and you look at the Teamsters too, so the UAW and the Teamsters, both of these organizations, I guess not everybody gets the chance to sort of know folks like you and I do, and just in the sense of because of media, we get to sort of meet folks who are in union movements and things like that. There are a lot of the people who are engaged in this work in these unions are our guys. You know what I mean? They share our kind of politics and vision, and that is an embeddedness in everyday working class politics that is I think is more beneficial than anything. It's so one's sort of cultivating the more radical and emancipatory aspects of those organizations, but too actively and actually participating in that in the way that they are is massive. And just briefly on what you said about in Marion and Cornell, it's just totally, I like all this stuff, but just the difficulty of social democracy is not even in the getting it, right? Which is hard enough already. It's that it will always be as weak and unstable as the capital system itself, which is to say extremely weak and unstable, because any kind of crisis in profit for the capitalist class is going to be met with reductions and rollbacks of the victories of the labor movement, right? It's suspending in air some of these kind of conflicts that are just embedded in society instead of actually fighting to end the conditions that put those things into conflict, right? In essence, building socialism. And this is the kind of difficult thing, because obviously there's a lot of social democratic reforms that I would love to see happen today, and I will fight for them and advocate for them. But in terms of actually making that kind of historic change that we need to see, it's just not up to the historic task of what's ahead of it. Now, it's easy to sit there and say all these kind of things because we also have a challenge ourselves, which is okay. Socialists can critique away all these kind of things, but where's the party? Where's the movement? Where's the revolution? Yeah. And I think that's where you have to go into these things with some humility, frankly. And, it's really interesting to see what, Gindin sort of lays out here, as to some of the kind of questions. Because remember, again, he's writing this at the dawning of the Trump era. We've went through Trump and Biden, and it's interesting to sort of see, what ended up coming together. So he starts talking about the importance of like building an organization, that is operating on mass political national scale. Call a party, whatever. But this is the thing that is engaged in that kind of work. He says, the institutional essence of trying to create a current or tendency has often been discussed, and this familiar ground can be summarized. Recruitment from the many activists mobilized by the Sanders campaign into socialist groupings would be formed in multiple centers. Each would develop a democratic structure, raise funds, and in terms of engagement, determine which movements and struggles to prioritize. The groups would develop an infrastructure for communication, internal debate, and public forums. They would eventually hire part-timers or full-time organizers, make links with other regions, and develop what Greg Albo calls political ecology of protest. That is, frame the protest within a larger political context. Progressive candidates would be supported for a bunch of local offices to build alliances, develop administrative skills within the movement, and provide a base for local experiments and alternative ways to address economic, environmental, cultural needs. And he goes on to sort of say, hey, speakers can come and participate. You can have debates. But underlying these institutional tasks would be a number of general political tasks. First, constantly hammering capitalism as an undemocratic social system that cannot meet popular needs, cannot meet human potentials, cannot avoid despoiling the planet. Second, insisting that if we are to do more than complain, we need to build an institutional capacity with some hope of matching capitalism's power. We need to move to deep organizing. Third, that at this particular moment, what is especially crucial is to organize ourselves to make the socialist idea relevant once more. That is to both create a new generation of intellectual organizers committed to socialism and through popular education contribute to placing socialism on the agenda again. A fourth, active engagement in existing union and movement struggles is elemental. He says, without this kind of engagement, we cannot possibly grasp the lay of the land, learn to deal with the inevitability of compromise, expand our base, or acting constructively. Within such struggles, the key challenge is to overcome the sense that the socialist perspectives are distant and impractical ideas and demonstrate that they matter now, that they can contribute in practical terms to developing and carrying out union and movement strategies. And I'm curious, if this rings true to you, Matt. I mean, there's a lot of this that you have seen that work has been engaged in to certain extents. I think some of them better than others. I think most notably what we're seeing right now with the union engagement is important. But this is sort of
I think that's good. I just would say, I think maybe we could get a little bit more of the hammering capitalism. I think, I respect a lot, particularly, with regards to Israel that, Rashid Tlaib and Ilhan and AOC have done. I think they've all kind of maybe shied a little bit away. Being pro-union is easier than being anti-capitalist, in a political context. But it would be, I think, a nice, upgrade to have some members, whether it's, even in city councils but in Congress, that are hammering capitalism like Panich's, because that is pretty absent, I think, from the politics now.
Yeah, and I think even within DSA itself, particularly to the public. I mean, it's there, don't get me wrong, but we've been seeing debates again about what we need is another organization that's a little bit more to be a kind of even bigger umbrella than the big tent that is DSA, to sort of organize kind of political union and labor fights, and then sort of use that to direct people into the DSA. I think that we should own certain kinds of ideas, and not shy away from, if there is the small, not small, but the minimum program strategy of some of the things that we're fighting for within this movement, we absolutely need to connect those to the larger thing. That's just, that is just that's not going to, nobody who's not already a socialist is going to be convinced that an idea is good because we say, hey, this is a socialist idea, right?
Yeah.
But not getting engaged in the work of saying, hey, these good ideas are socialist ideas. And also capitalism is the thing that creates these things, prevents us from actually being able to build out the capacity of our organizations and our base and do mass recruitment if we're not being very explicit about like the reasons why we're engaged in certain kind of things. It's always been a kind of tension that people get into is like, oh, I don't want to call myself a socialist because I don't want to alienate people. And I get it to a certain extent. But eventually I think you have to rip off the Band-Aid and hold on to these things and do that work. Because at a certain point, if we're not, then, we are sort of not engaged in that socialist work. We might be engaged in good work, good pro-union, progressive work, but not socialist work.
Yeah.
Just in the interest of time, he goes through some kind of political challenges in terms of orientation on messaging that I think are all pretty good. Some of it is funny because it is so like 2016 sort of has to talk about the kind of Hillary Clinton challenge to Bernie Sanders, about how to deal with the question that socialists are like against racial justice or, ending sexism or all this kind of stuff. Interesting. But I don't want to be too glib and say, hopefully we've moved past that, but,
for now, maybe we have. We'll get another flare for that later.
I'm sure we will.
See if Biden loses. If Biden loses, despite himself being a white guy, it's going to be because.
I mean, they did that in 2020, man. Is that like not supporting Biden? Because basically it's like, Biden has support in the black community. Therefore, like criticizing Biden means criticizing like the black community as a whole. No, I mean, they will. There are incredible techniques in the Democratic shill school of rhetoric. But yeah, we can jump to the next one, which I think is an important one on unions. It says, today, there's no avoiding the most fundamental questions about the capacity of existing unions to play a role in social transformation. Is union renewal and radicalization possible? And especially critical to the place of a socialist current, is this possible without the intervention of socialists committed to that reinvention of unions? And I think that is something too that, we sort of have to reckon with, is, being engaged in this fight for unions, high unionization rates and all that kind of stuff. But also doing the work of fundamentally changing the structures of a lot of these unions. A great example of this is what's happened within the UAW since Sam Gindin has written this. Democratizing that union made them so much more prepared to take on this most recent strike and take on the positions that they have. And it wouldn't have happened without the democratization efforts within that union. I just don't think this is in doubt. And that's just something that has to happen across the board.
Absolutely.
And then there's some other political lessons here that I just think, as interesting as it is, might not be as critical. But he sort of ends it here with the task ahead. And in good fashion, we will just read the conclusion here and then give our final thoughts. The task for socialists is to initiate and sustain a determined The task for socialists is to initiate and sustain a determined systematic drive to build popular new understandings and to develop its own and popular capacities. Without denying the complexities, uncertainties, and difficulties involved, the socialist left must finally put in motion the tentative steps that might in time make the socialist vision a popular alternative again. I think that's where we're at, is sort of, I highly suggest people read the piece by Gindin here. And it sort of lays out, I think, some of the real practical concerns that go into the idea of building a mass party. Just to be explicit, Gindin thinks that there will be there's just not a possibility of doing things that we want to do without a socialist party, a workers' party. But he's also not somebody who's like starry-eyed that like any attempt is the good one. Rather actually lays out, I think, very clearly a lot of the pitfalls and things to avoid, and also lining out some of the capacities and things that would have to be developed to be able to do it. It's interesting to sort of read that piece and see what has transpired since, I think, most, notably around the labor question, as Matt was saying, but also seeing, the explosion of of socialists in the country, people who identify as socialists, some of those institutions and organizations. And I think, holding them up against the rubric that Sam Gindin lays out there, I think is a healthy thing to take to your, political work if you can.
Yeah, it's like it's weird because it's like simultaneously you can see silver linings, and then you can see like, oh, actually things have gotten darker than were forecasted, and it's hard to know. It's basically depends on your mood in the moment, which you want to emphasize more. But I do think like he's right in the where he emphasizes. Socialist left must find a way to escape the repeated submersion of politics in the swamp of the electoral cycle. I mean, you look at the UAW not endorsing Biden, I think, and monitoring how that goes over this next year is going to be very interesting to me, because I fully support that decision to have not endorsed Biden, and that was even before what's going on in Gaza, and so those sorts of faculties being developed, I think, are as exciting as anything I'm seeing on the electoral realm. Despite that, Robin Wansley getting her second term.
Hell yeah.
In Minnesota. Like, there are things being done, I think, on the local level that are difficult to, I think, share.
Hundreds
of
DSA electeds across the country. Actually, I think over 1,000, if I'm recalling correctly. Everything from smaller seats to big city council, state ledge, things like that. I mean, there are a lot of focus is always on the congressional stuff. But yeah, totally. I think that's an important thing to highlight. Well, folks, appreciate you all spending a little bit of your Sunday with us on our first. Sorry, what is it again? Article canon. We'll see if we want to keep doing these. If y'all have any suggestions on pieces, we would love, to hear them. Appreciate everybody so much. We'll be back on Tuesday with the main show. Have a good rest of your weekend and take care.
Peace.